Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're talking about how not to become a good programmer, and today's topic is use string literals and magic numbers. And by that, of course, I mean please don't use string literals and magic numbers. Let's examine what I mean by that. So let's talk about why using string literals is a bad idea and why it will immediately identify you as not a good programmer. So in teaching code, you'll often see us using string literals, but in a real world situation, you're opening yourself up to many different types of problems. Just to give you a quick example, here I'm setting my device vendor to one of these values, Cisco, Juniper, or Arista. And just for your information, this is in the Python 52 Weeks of Python course that talks about enums and constants, so go check that out if you want more detail. But I'm using them, I'm setting them here, and then I'm using it right away. Well, what if I didn't know whether that should be a capital C or not? And so in my test, which may not be right next to it, obviously I can see this, but if it's in a different part of the code, in a different module, or done by a different individual, look at the nice helpful error that PyCharm gives me. It doesn't. It has no idea that I have misspelled this between my two different situations. This code will not work. On the other hand, what if I were to do something like this? I was to go and say, I'm going to create a constant called capital Cisco, and it's going to be this value. Now I'm calling it this value, which is going to be important because if I want to change it, I can change it in the one spot where I set the constant. But if I were to go down here using my simple example, here I'm using constants. What if I was to say, well, I'm not sure how this is spelled, so I'm going to do Cisco like that. What's going to happen? Well, PyCharm is going to squawk at me and it's going to say, I have no idea what that is. And so not only do I have the ability to change what this value ought to be, as I've done right there, but I also have PyCharm working to my advantage to tell me, hey, there's an error here. You need to not do that. You need to use the correct thing. Now, if I was to use something like a class where I define member data within a class, it's the same type of idea. If I were to come down here and I were to spell this incorrectly, then even though PyCharm is not smart enough to know for sure that that's an error, can you see how it highlighted it right there? And it's saying, you know what, I don't really know that there's something called Cisco in vendor. So when I ran this, of course, it would throw an error. And so using constants, either as actual constants like this, constants within a class, or you can do enums as well. I don't go through this here. I do go through it in the full form, long form of the 52 Weeks of Python. You can find more about that. But don't use string literals throughout your code. It's much better to use constants or some type of class constant like I'm showing you here. So the second category for how to do things wrong and show that you're a bad programmer is to use magic numbers in your code rather than using constants. So here I'm up ahead in a concurrency module that's part of 52 Weeks of Python in my host monitor. So this is just a small program. There's not a ton going on here, but I have at least in this situation used constants rather than using magic numbers. Now this is going to be fairly easy to understand. This discovery interval is something that I'm going to be using when I sleep in my main program here. I'm using it right at this. Now I could have just put like, let's say 300 here, and I probably could have figured out, okay, let's see, date, time now, last discovery, total seconds, what's going on. But do you see how using a constant makes it much more straightforward and clear what exactly I am doing? I'm waiting until I go past my discovery interval, and then once I've gone past it, I do a discovery. And the same thing is true for my monitor interval. Now, if I would be using these across all of my different monitors or discovery programs or whatever, then you can see how it would be especially helpful if I did want to change my discovery interval. I only have to do it right here, and it will magically take place. I don't have to find every spot in my code where I use that magic number and change it appropriately. So you want to do this idea of defining constants not only for string literals but for magic numbers as well. So remember, if you want to become a good programmer, don't use string literals and magic numbers. Use some form of constants instead.